Madam, na today oh, I don't wait 2 weeks.
Please, sir, small time. I'm trying.
The rejection email arrived on a Tuesday morning, the same day Alice's landlord knocked on her door for rent that was already 2 weeks late. She read it standing up, phone in one hand, a bucket of soaking clothes in the other. 4 lines. No explanation. Just a polite way of saying no. It was the 11th one that year. She had stopped counting after the 8th, but her son David counted for her, quietly, without telling her he was counting. Alice was 39 years old and had been raising David alone since he was 4. His father left before David could form a full sentence, and by the time the boy learned to say "Mummy" clearly, he had also learned not to ask about a man who wasn't coming back. Alice never explained it to him in detail. She simply worked. She sold fabric at a stall for 6 years, then switched to baking small chops for events. When the fabric business collapsed under multiple loans she was still repaying, every kobo she made had one destination: David's school fees. Primary school had been manageable, barely. Secondary school stretched her thin, but she found a way, borrowing from a cooperative here, skipping meals there. She told herself it would get easier once he finished secondary school. It did not get easier. It got harder, because David passed his final exams with results good enough to get into a public tertiary institution, and suddenly the fees she was used to paying tripled. She remembered the night he brought the admission letter home. His face lit up in a way she hadn't seen in years. He held it out to her like a trophy.
Mommy, I got in.
"Mummy, I got in." She smiled, hugged him, told him God was faithful, and then went into her room and cried into a wrapper so he wouldn't hear her. Getting in wasn't the problem. Staying in was the problem. The letter listed a figure for tuition, acceptance fee, and departmental dues that made her stomach fold. That was the season the applications started. She applied for cleaning jobs, catering jobs, factory jobs, anything that paid steadily. She applied at hotels, at a bottling company, at 2 schools looking for a kitchen assistant. Some didn't reply. Some replied with rejection. One place told her she was overqualified, which confused her because she had never felt qualified for anything in her life, only desperate enough to try. It was during this season, worn thin from disappointment, that Deborah approached her after Sunday service. Deborah was not a close friend, more of a familiar face from the women's fellowship, the kind of person you greeted every week but never sat beside. She was older than Alice, maybe by 10 years, with the confident stride of someone who had traveled and returned with stories. "Alice, a word," she said, pulling her gently by the elbow as the congregation dispersed under the afternoon sun. Alice paused, adjusting her scarf. "Yes, Ma. You still dey find work?" The question landed somewhere between hope and irritation. Everyone in her circle knew she was job hunting. She had asked around enough times that the question had become a kind of running joke, except it wasn't funny to her. "Yes, Ma. Anything at all." Deborah lowered her voice, the way people do when what they're about to say feels important. "There's an opportunity. Church program, partnership with an agency abroad. They take people we want work. Cleaning, caregiving, hospitality. Free ticket, free processing. You just need small documentation fee, an interview when you land." Alice's chest tightened, not with fear, but with something dangerously close to hope. She had heard of programs like this before, some legitimate, many not. She asked questions. Deborah answered patiently, showed her a flyer with a church logo she recognized, mentioned 2 other women from a neighboring parish who had already gone the previous month and were settling in fine. That night, Alice sat on her bed with the flyer in her hand, David asleep on the mattress across the room, his textbooks stacked beside his pillow, like a small fortress. She looked at him for a long time. He had grown taller that year, his voice deeper, his jaw sharper, edging into manhood faster than she was ready for. He needed her to find something, anything. He needed her not to give up. She prayed that night, the kind of prayer that doesn't use polished words, just raw need laid out plainly. Lord, if this is from you, open the way. If it is not, close it. But please, don't let my boy's future die, because I ran out of options. 3 weeks later, she was on a plane for the first time in her life, clutching a small bag, a photocopy of her documents, and a folded piece of paper with David's phone number written twice, in case one copy got lost. The flight itself felt like a dream she wasn't sure she'd wake up from. She had never seen clouds from above. She pressed her forehead to the window somewhere over unfamiliar terrain and thought about her mother, long deceased, who used to say that God moves people the way wind moves seeds, scattering them into soil they never chose, for harvests they cannot yet see. Landing brought her back to Earth in more ways than one. The agency representative who met her at the airport was polite but rushed, herding a small group of new arrivals into a van with the efficiency of someone who did this often and felt nothing about it anymore. They were driven to a shared apartment on the outskirts of the city, 4 women to a room, mattresses on the floor, a single window that let in more noise than light. The interview was scheduled for the following week. Alice used the days before it to rehearse. She practiced her English pronunciation in front of a cracked mirror, straightened the 2 blouses she owned, and reviewed a folder of certificates that suddenly looked thinner and less impressive than they had back home. When the day came, she sat in a waiting room with 11 other applicants, all hoping for the same handful of positions. The interviewer, a woman with sharp eyes and a clipped voice, asked about her experience, her certifications, her availability, her ability to work under supervision in a structured corporate environment. Alice answered as honestly as she could. Yes, she had experience cooking and cleaning. No, she did not have a formal certification in hospitality management. No, she had not worked in a structured institutional setting before, only informal, self-run trade. Yes, she was a fast learner. Yes, she was reliable. The woman nodded through all of it, the way people nod when they've already made up their mind and are simply being courteous until the meeting ends. "We'll be in touch," she said. They were not in touch. 2 days later, a short message informed Alice that she did not meet the specific requirements for the available roles at this time, and that her file would be kept on record for future opportunities. She read the message 3 times, sitting on the edge of her mattress, roommates asleep around her. She did not cry immediately. The tears came later, quietly, into a pillow that wasn't hers, in a country where nobody knew her name well enough to ask what was wrong. She thought of David. She thought of the fees still unpaid. She thought of the free ticket that had felt like an answered prayer and now felt like a trapdoor she had walked into willingly. She thought about going home, but home meant facing the same walls, the same unpaid balance, the same rejection letters, except now with travel debt added to the pile, because the documentation fee she had paid had drained the small savings she kept for emergencies. She made a decision that night that many people in her position had made before her. She would stay, not because the plan had worked, but because going back empty-handed felt heavier than staying and figuring something out. Finding work without the right papers or connections was its own education. She started with what was available to someone in her situation, cleaning gigs arranged informally through other West African women she met at a local market, women who had learned to survive in the gaps between the systems that weren't built for them. Her first job was scrubbing floors in a small restaurant kitchen, 3 times a week, cash in hand, no contract, no guarantees. The owner was a stern man who barely acknowledged her beyond instructions. She didn't mind. She had scrubbed harder floors for less. She added a second job cleaning a private home twice a week, an elderly woman who lived alone and complained about everything except Alice's work, which she never once criticized. Alice liked her, in the quiet way you like someone who treats you like a person rather than a function. The money was small, spread thin across rent for a shared room, food, and whatever she could send home. It was not enough to significantly help with David's fees, but it was enough to keep her from becoming a burden to anyone. And there was a strange dignity in that, even on the hardest days. She called David every Sunday, after church, using a card she bought from a small shop that specialized in international calling credit. Their conversations followed a familiar rhythm. "How is school?" "Fine, Mummy." "You are eating?" "Yes, Mummy." "The fees, how far?" A pause. Always a pause. "I'm managing." The department gave us small extension. She knew he was protecting her from the full weight of his situation, the way she had spent years protecting him from hers. It was a strange inheritance, this instinct to shield the people you love from truths that might break them. What Alice didn't know, because David never told her, was that he had stopped attending some lectures not because he was lazy, but because he had started doing something else entirely, something born out of necessity rather than ambition. David had always been good with his hands, better with wires and circuits than with essays and equations. It wasn't a talent anyone had cultivated deliberately, it simply showed up early, in the way he used to take apart broken radios as a child, just to understand how sound came out of them, then put them back together, mostly working, always different. In his first year at the institution, money had been tight even before it became a crisis. He noticed early that generators in the male hostel broke down constantly, and the one man who repaired them, an elderly artisan named Isaac who ran a small shop just outside the school gate, was overwhelmed with more work than he could handle alone. David started hanging around the shop after lectures, at first just watching, asking questions, handing tools. Isaac, gruff but observant, noticed the boy actually understood what he was looking at, not just curious but capable. "You want to learn? Or you just waste my time?" Isaac asked one evening, half joking, half serious. "I want to learn, sir." "Then hold this and don't touch anything until I tell you." That was the beginning of an apprenticeship nobody had planned. David spent his free hours at the shop, learning to diagnose faults in small generators, rewire damaged switches, replace burnt components. Isaac didn't pay him much at first, mostly food and transport fare, but the skill itself became a kind of currency. Word spread among students that the boy at Isaac's shop could fix a generator faster and cheaper than sending it into town. By his second year, David was earning modest but steady income repairing small electronics and generators for students and a few staff members. It wasn't glamorous work. His hands stayed permanently stained with engine grease, and he sometimes missed early lectures because a repair ran long, but it kept him afloat during months when Alice's transfers were thin or delayed, and it gave him something his coursework hadn't: quiet, private confidence that he was capable of solving real problems with his own two hands. He didn't tell his mother the full extent of it. He didn't want her worrying that he was neglecting his studies, even though his grades, never spectacular, stayed steady enough to keep him enrolled. He wasn't the best student in his class. He wasn't on any scholarship list. He was, in the plainest sense, an ordinary young man doing extraordinary things quietly, out of necessity, without an audience. The turning point began on an unremarkable Thursday, the kind of day that doesn't announce itself as significant until much later. A man named Abraham had driven into the community to visit a relative on campus. His car, an aging sedan that had seen better decades, developed a fault in the electrical system just outside the school gate, sputtering to a stop in a cloud of faint smoke. Frustrated and unfamiliar with the area, he was directed by a passerby to the boy who fixes things near the hostel. David examined the car with the same patient thoroughness he applied to every generator that came his way. It took him nearly 2 hours, working past the point most people would have given up and called a proper mechanic in town. When he finished, the car started cleanly, no hesitation, no sputtering. Abraham was visibly relieved, and something in the way David worked, careful, unhurried, honest about what was wrong rather than exaggerating the problem to charge more, stayed with him. When David quoted a fair price, lower than Abraham expected, Abraham insisted on paying more. "No, sir," David said, handing back the extra notes. "This is the correct price. I don't take more than what is fair." It was a small moment. David didn't think much of it, beyond relief that the job was done and he could return to his room and prepare for a test the next morning. But Abraham thought about it the whole drive back to the city. He mentioned it, almost in passing, to a colleague a few days later, a woman named Rhoda, who managed logistics for a mid-sized company with an international arm. The same city, in fact, where Alice had been cleaning floors and homes for the better part of a year. "There was this young man," Abraham said, "fixed my car properly and refused to overcharge me. You don't find that everywhere. Reminded me that character still exists in young people, even with everything going on around us." Rhoda listened, filed the story away the way people do with small, pleasant anecdotes, and thought little more of it until, 2 weeks later, her company posted an opening for support staff, cleaning and facilities assistants, but with a formal contract, proper pay, and a pathway to more stable roles for anyone who showed diligence and reliability. It was Rhoda who, reviewing a stack of informal referrals from cleaners already working in the building, one of them being the elderly woman whose home Alice cleaned twice a week and who had, without Alice's knowledge, mentioned her name warmly to a friend who worked in the same company, connected two threads that had never been meant to touch. The elderly woman's recommendation reached Rhoda's desk the same week Abraham's story about the honest young mechanic came up again in casual office conversation. Rhoda didn't connect the two immediately. Nobody did. Not even Alice, not yet. What Alice knew, in that moment, was simpler and smaller. She had been invited for an interview at a proper company, on the recommendation of the elderly woman she had faithfully served without complaint for months. A woman who had, without any grand announcement, been quietly paying attention the whole time. Alice sat in her small shared room the night before the interview, hands trembling slightly as she ironed the only blouse smart enough for the occasion. She thought about the first interview, the rejection, the humiliation of feeling unqualified in a room full of people who seemed to belong there more than she did. She prayed again that night, not the desperate prayer of a woman with nothing, but the steadier prayer of someone who had learned, through months of scrubbing floors and small disappointments, that faithfulness in obscurity was not the same as being forgotten. "Lord," she whispered, "you closed one door. I didn't understand why. I still don't fully understand. But if this is the door you actually meant for me, let it open. And if it's not, give me the strength to keep scrubbing floors with joy, because even that has been you providing." She didn't know, as she folded that blouse and set it aside for the morning, that 400 kilometers away, in a small hostel room, her son was closing a textbook after a long night of both studying and repairing a fellow student's broken lamp for extra cash. Equally unaware that a stranger's car trouble weeks earlier had quietly set something in motion that neither of them had asked for, planned, or could have engineered on their own. Some doors, Alice would later say, don't open because you finally became qualified enough to deserve them. They open because somewhere, in a season you can't see, faithfulness was already doing its slow, invisible work. The company's building was taller than any structure Alice had ever walked into on purpose. Glass front, revolving doors, a lobby that smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and fresh coffee. She arrived 30 minutes early, sat on a leather bench near the reception desk, and pressed her palms flat against her knees to stop them from shaking. A young receptionist eventually called her name, mispronouncing it slightly, and led her down a corridor to a small meeting room where Rhoda was already seated, reading through a slim folder. Rhoda looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't performative, just naturally warm. "Alice, thank you for coming. Please, sit." The interview itself was nothing like the first one. There were no rapid-fire questions about certifications she didn't have. Rhoda asked about her work history in plain terms, listened without interrupting, and nodded at details Alice hadn't expected anyone to care about: how she managed her time across 2 cleaning jobs, how she had never once missed a scheduled day with the elderly woman, despite the distance she had to walk when transport fare was tight. "She speaks very highly of you," Rhoda said. "Consistency like that is rare. We can train someone on procedures. We can't train character." Alice didn't know what to say to that, so she simply thanked her, twice, softly. 2 days later, she received a call, not a text message this time, a real voice on the other end of the line, offering her a position in facilities support, with a signed contract, a fixed schedule, and a wage that made her sit down slowly on the edge of her mattress and stay silent for a full minute before she could speak. She called David that evening, and for once, it was her voice that trembled through the receiver. David, I got something. A real job, contract and everything." There was a pause on his end, the kind of pause that comes from someone trying not to cry into a phone in a shared hostel corridor. "Mummy, thank God, thank God." "Yes," she said, "thank God." Neither of them knew, in that moment, the full chain of small decisions that had led to that call. A stranger's stalled car, a young man's refusal to overcharge, a passing remark in an office corridor, an elderly woman's quiet loyalty. They only knew what most people know in moments like that something had shifted, and it felt like relief. The years that followed were not dramatic. They were steady, which for Alice was its own kind of miracle. She worked hard, the way she had always worked hard, except now the effort translated into something that compounded rather than simply kept her afloat. Within 2 years, she was promoted to a supervisory role over a small team of cleaning staff, not because she sought promotion aggressively, but because Rhoda, who watched more than she spoke, noticed patterns that others missed. The extra income meant David's fees stopped being an emergency and became, simply, a bill, paid on time, without the frantic borrowing that had defined his earlier years in school. He finished his program with average grades, nothing that would earn him a place on any honors list, but a certificate nonetheless, and a set of practical skills that no transcript could fully capture. He didn't abandon the mechanical and electrical work he'd picked up under Isaac's rough tutelage. If anything, he expanded it. By his final year, he had saved enough from repairs and small jobs to buy proper tools of his own, and shortly after graduation, he opened a modest workshop in a rented space near the same school gate where he'd once learned by holding wrenches for an old man who barely paid him. Isaac, older now and slower with his hands, became less of a boss and more of an occasional advisor, dropping by the workshop to drink tea and offer opinions David rarely asked for but always respected. "You do well," Isaac told him once, watching David rewire a control panel with the same unhurried precision he'd shown as a nervous teenager years earlier. "I never doubt you. You never showed it," David said, laughing. "That's because doubt would have spoiled you. And confidence too early spoils a young man." David built the workshop into something steady, then something modest but genuinely profitable, expanding from generators into small appliance repair, then into basic electrical installation for new buildings going up around the growing town. He hired 2 apprentices of his own eventually, young men as unpolished and eager as he had once been, and found himself repeating, almost word for word, some of the same gruff instructions Isaac had once given him. He got married in his late 20s, not to anyone connected to this story, quietly, without fanfare, and Alice traveled home for the ceremony, the first trip back since she'd left all those years earlier. She cried through most of it, though she insisted afterward that it was simply dust in her eyes. Life continued the way life does, in ordinary rhythms that don't often announce their significance until much later. 15 years is a long time, long enough for a young man's grease-stained hands to become a business owner's calloused ones. Long enough for a woman's rented shared room to become, eventually, her own modest apartment, paid for slowly, in installments, without debt. Long enough for memories to soften at the edges, for specific dates to blur, for a stalled car outside a school gate to become the kind of story nobody thinks to tell because it never seemed important enough to repeat. The reveal, when it came, arrived the way most true things do, unplanned, in the middle of an unrelated conversation. The company Alice worked for was hosting an anniversary dinner, a modest affair to mark 15 years since its founding. Staff and management gathered in the same building Alice had once walked into trembling. She had, by then, worked her way into a role coordinating facilities management for the entire building, trusted enough to sit at the same tables as people who once would have overlooked her entirely. Abraham was there that evening, not as an employee, but as a longtime business associate of the company, invited as a guest for the anniversary. He had grown heavier with age, grayer at the temples, but his manner remained the same, easy and observant. At some point in the evening, seated near Rhoda and a small circle of others, the conversation drifted, as conversations at such events often do, toward how the company had grown, the people who had shaped it, the small decisions that had mattered more than anyone realized at the time. "You know," Abraham said, swirling a glass of juice he'd been nursing for an hour, "I still think about that young mechanic sometimes. The one who fixed my car outside that school years ago, refused to overcharge me. I mentioned it to Rhoda once, just in passing. Funny how a small thing like that stays with you." Rhoda smiled, memory surfacing slowly. "That's actually how I first heard Alice's name properly, you know. Not directly from you, but around the same time. Different sources, same week. Odd how that happens." Alice, seated 2 chairs away, had been half listening to another conversation entirely, but the mention of her own name pulled her attention fully into the exchange. "My name?" she asked. Rhoda turned to her, surprised. "Yes. Don't you remember? When we posted that opening years ago, I had 2 things land on my desk almost the same week. One was a recommendation from a woman you used to clean for, who spoke about you constantly. The other was this story Abraham kept telling, about a young mechanic near some school, refused to take extra money for honest work. It stuck with me. Character like that. Made me think twice about how I evaluated candidates that season. I was frankly a bit more open, a bit less rigid about formal qualifications that round, because of stories like that." Alice sat very still. "A young mechanic, near a school." "Yes," Abraham said, chuckling at the memory. "Sharp young man. Fixed my car properly when it broke down outside some institution, years back now. Wouldn't even take the extra money I tried to give him." Alice's fork stopped halfway to her plate. Something in her chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with the strange vertigo of recognition arriving from an unexpected angle. "What was his name?" she asked, quietly. Abraham thought for a moment, brow furrowing. "David, I believe." "Yes, David. Worked near a mechanic's shop by the school gate." The room did not go silent. Conversations continued around them. Plates clinked. Someone laughed at a joke 3 tables away. But for Alice, something folded inward and then opened again. Slowly, like a door she hadn't known existed, swinging into a room she thought she already fully understood. "That's my son," she said. Rhoda set down her glass. Abraham turned fully toward her, disbelief and delight moving across his face almost simultaneously. "Your son fixed my car?" 15 years ago, Alice said, doing the arithmetic slowly in her head. "He would have been in his 2nd year. Yes, that would be him. He used to work with an old man named Isaac, near the school gate." Abraham let out a long breath, something between a laugh and an exhale of genuine amazement. "I told that story so many times over the years, and I never once thought to connect it to anything beyond itself. I just remembered a decent young man in a world that doesn't always produce them." Rhoda reached over and touched Alice's hand gently. "Alice, do you understand what this means?" The reason I looked twice at your file, the reason I was willing to overlook the fact that you didn't have formal hospitality certifications, part of that willingness came from a story about honesty that your own son had planted in this building years before you ever walked into it. Alice sat with that revelation for a long time after the dinner ended, long after she had returned to her apartment, changed out of her good dress, and sat by her window, looking out at a city that had once felt entirely foreign and now simply felt like home. She thought about the first rejection, the one that had felt, at the time, like proof that she wasn't good enough, that the free ticket had led her into a dead end. She thought about the humiliation of that interview, the woman's clipped voice telling her she didn't meet requirements. For years, she had quietly carried that rejection as an unresolved wound, one of many small failures stitched into the larger fabric of her struggle. She hadn't known, couldn't have known, that while she sat in that first waiting room feeling inadequate, her son, hundreds of kilometers away, was quietly building a reputation one honest repair at a time, laying groundwork for a door that hadn't even existed yet, in a building she hadn't yet walked into, through a company she had never heard of. She thought about David refusing that extra money from Abraham, a decision so small it likely took him less than a minute to make, forgotten by him almost immediately afterward, absorbed into the ordinary rhythm of a busy week. He had not done it strategically. He had not done it hoping it would somehow reach his mother years later. He had simply done what was right because it was right, the way Isaac had modeled for him, the way faith had quietly shaped his instincts long before he understood why it mattered. That was the part that undid her most, sitting alone by her window that night. Not the coincidence of it, though it was remarkable enough on its own. It was the realization that faithfulness in obscurity is never actually wasted. Even when no one is watching, even when the person practicing it has no idea their integrity is quietly opening doors in places they will never personally see. She remembered her own choices during those hard years, choosing to clean the elderly woman's home with full effort, even when the pay was small, choosing not to cut corners at the restaurant kitchen, even when no one checked her work closely, choosing to keep showing up despite exhaustion and disappointment. She had done those things simply because that was who she was, not because she expected any of it to matter beyond the immediate task in front of her, and yet it had mattered. Both of their separate, unremarkable acts of integrity, hers and David's, offered in two different places, years apart, with no awareness of each other, had converged in a single decision made by a stranger, reviewing a stack of applications in an office neither of them had any connection to at the time. She called David that same night, later than she normally would, but she knew he would understand once she explained. "David," she said, when he picked up, voice thick with sleep and mild concern at the late hour. "Do you remember, years ago, a man's car breaking down outside the school gate? You fixed it, refused to take extra payment." There was a pause, David clearly searching through years of similar small jobs blurred together by repetition. "I fixed a lot of cars back then, Mummy." "Which one?" An older man, gray hair now, but not then. "Business trip. His name is Abraham." Another pause, longer this time, and then, slowly, recognition. "I think I remember. Yes, actually, I remember because Isaac scolded me for not taking the extra money, said I was too soft for business." Alice laughed, tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. "That man works with the company I've been at all these years. Tonight, at a dinner, we found out that the story he told about you, about your honesty, was part of the reason Rhoda gave me a real chance when I was interviewed. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Alice wondered if the call had dropped. When David spoke again, his voice had changed, quieter, more careful. "You're telling me that something I did as a broke student, something I don't even fully remember doing, that Isaac scolded me for, somehow helped you get the job that changed everything for us?" "Yes," Alice said simply, Another silence, and then, softly, "I don't even know what to say to that." "You don't have to say anything," Alice told him. "I just needed you to know. 15 years, David. 15 years I carried that first rejection like it was a mistake, like something had gone wrong that day. I kept asking God why that door closed. Tonight, I finally understood. It didn't close because I failed. It closed because the door that was actually meant for me hadn't been prepared yet. And you, without knowing it, without trying, were part of preparing it. There is a particular kind of faith that doesn't announce itself with signs and wonders, the dramatic, visible kind that people testify about in front of large crowds. This was not that kind of story. No one saw an angel. No one heard an audible voice. What happened instead was quieter and, in some ways, more demanding of trust. Two people, separated by distance and unaware of each other's daily struggles, choosing integrity in moments too small for either of them to consider significant, and God weaving those separate threads together across 15 years into a pattern only visible in hindsight. Alice often thought, in the years that followed that dinner, about how easily either of those threads could have been cut. David could have taken the extra money from Abraham. Most people would have, and no one would have blamed him. Alice could have grown bitter after that first rejection. Could have stopped showing up fully for jobs that seemed to lead nowhere. Could have let disappointment shrink her effort. Either failure, small as it might have seemed at the time, could have unraveled a connection neither of them knew was forming. She understood, finally, something she had heard preached many times without fully absorbing it, that faithfulness is rarely rewarded on the timeline or in the manner people expect. It is not a transaction completed quickly, effort exchanged immediately for outcome. It is closer to seed planted in soil the planter will never personally walk through again, trusting that growth, when it comes, will come in its own season, often reaching people the planter never anticipated. David, for his part, carried the story differently. He didn't become someone obsessed with searching for hidden meaning behind every small kindness afterward, calculating what future benefit each honest act might yield. If anything, the lesson settled into him more simply than that. He began telling his own apprentices, years later, watching them grow careless with customers who wouldn't notice if they cut corners, a version of what Isaac had once told him without him fully understanding it at the time. "Do the work right," he would say, wiping grease from his hands, "even when nobody important is watching, even when you don't know who's watching at all. You don't know whose life your small honesty is quietly building toward. Sometimes it's not even your own." Alice retired from active supervisory work eventually, years after that anniversary dinner, having built enough stability to eventually return home for good, closer to David, closer to the grandchildren who now filled her days with a different, gentler kind of exhaustion. She still told the story occasionally, at church gatherings, to younger women wrestling with the same disappointments she once carried, women convinced that a closed door meant they had failed, or that God had forgotten them. She would tell them, gently, without exaggeration, about the free ticket, the failed interview, the years of scrubbing floors that felt like they were leading nowhere. She would tell them about a mechanic shop near a school gate, and a stranger's stalled car, and a decision made in less than a minute by a tired young man who simply refused to take money that wasn't his. And then she would say the thing she had come to believe more firmly than almost anything else her long, uneven journey had taught her, that God's delays are rarely denials. Sometimes they are simply the quiet, unglamorous work of arranging pieces you cannot yet see, through people you have not yet met, for a purpose that will only make sense fully in hindsight, sometimes years later, sometimes not until the story finally comes full circle in a room you never expected to sit in.